Imagine a land where diamonds lie underfoot, but the people walk barefoot. Where gold is mined, but schools crumble. This isn't fiction. This is Africa. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
Today, we're embarking on quite a journey, a deep dive into Africa's history of exploitation, the very real and lasting impact of that, and also this powerful resurgence that seems to be stirring across the continent right now.
It's a huge topic, and the history is complex, often shaped by centuries of outside interests, sometimes with just devastating results for the people there.
Yeah.
We've pulled together quite a stack of sources for this: historical accounts, academic analysis, recent reports, even some firsthand perspectives on the changes happening right now.
So the mission today...
Really, it's to help you see the patterns, understand the depth of the trauma, but also grasp the significance of, well, what feels like a real awakening unfolding today.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Our sources take us way back, actually, to the 15th century. That's when European powers first started kind of looking towards Africa.
Right, but that interest really exploded much later during what's called the Scramble for Africa. That's roughly 1884 to 1914.
And this wasn't just about diplomats drawing lines on a map in Berlin, was it?
No, not at all, no. The core driver, overwhelmingly, was economic extraction. Powers like Belgium, Britain, France, they saw a continent incredibly rich in resources.
Gold, diamond.
Rubber, ivory, timber, you name it. They didn't just want territory, they wanted the stuff in the territory. And they built entire systems, administrative, economic design specifically to get those resources out and back to Europe.
And often that meant dismantling whatever local structures were already there.
Precisely. Existing governance, economies, social systems, they were often ignored or actively broken down if they got in the way of extraction.
And our sources point to one example as, well, maybe the most brutal, the starkest illustration of this pure extraction system: the Congo Free State under King Leopold II of Belgium.
Yeah, the Congo Free State. It's a truly horrific chapter. Between 1885 and 1908, this vast area, many, many times larger than Belgium itself, wasn't even a Belgian colony in the normal sense.
It was his personal property.
Exactly. His personal domain, managed purely for his profit by a very small administration. Initially, they focused on ivory, which was profitable, but then something else happened.
The rubber boom.
The rubber boom. Late 1890s, the Industrial Revolution, demand for natural rubber just went through the roof.
Bicycles, cars.
When suddenly the Congo's vines became incredibly valuable, hugely valuable. And Leopold's approach shifted. He essentially declared all land he considered vacant, which was most of it, as state property.
Meaning his property.
His property. And therefore, the resources on it, like rubber and ivory, belonged to him or the state he controlled. He then granted concessions to private companies, often companies he had a stake in, and kept a huge chunk as his personal crown domain.
And the profits were obscene.
Obscene is the right word. Our sources mention companies getting rates of return over 100%. Leopold himself, between 1896 and 1905 alone, is estimated to have made something like 70 million Belgian francs, personally, just from the Congo.
Built on what, though? How did they actually get all that rubber out of the forest?
Well, this is the darkest part. It was built on forced labor, pure and simple.
Not wages, not trade.
No. The Free State administration implemented policies of what they called constraint and repression. Villages were given impossible quotas for rubber collection.
Impossible quotas.
Yes, quotas that were often physically impossible to meet. And if you refused, or if you failed, the punishment was severe. They used the Force Public Leopold's private colonial army to enforce these quotas.
And this is where the accounts become almost unbearable. The level of brutality described in the sources.
It's difficult to talk about, frankly. The methods were designed to inflict terror and ensure compliance. Failure to meet rubber quotas often meant death. Mutilation was common.
And severed hands.
Yes. Infamously, soldiers in the force public were sometimes required to provide a severed hand as proof that they hadn't wasted ammunition on hunting animals instead of, well, people.
Proof of killing.
Proof of killing or proof of punishment. There's a particularly haunting image mentioned in one source of a man named Nasala, just staring at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, who was killed because his village failed to meet its quota.
It's just unimaginable. Was this like rogue soldiers?
Yeah.
Or systemic?
The sources suggest it was systemic. While Leopold himself apparently disapproved of the hand severing not out of humanity, but because it reduced the productivity of his workforce.
It damaged his assets.
Precisely. But the system he created relied on terror. Mutilation was a widespread tool of that terror. Another horrific tactic was taking hostages. Wives, children, elders seized from villages and held in stockades.
To force the men to collect rubber.
Yes, held in terrible conditions, high death rates in those stockades just to coerce the workers.
And the violence wasn't only about rubber collection, was it?
No, the force public was also used to brutally crush any African communities or states that resisted Leopold's rule. Places like the Yet Kingdom, the Zande Federation, they fought back and were suppressed violently. There were also military mutinies within the force public itself, like the Tela mutinies.
Oh, constant violence.
Constant violence. And it wasn't just the Congolese. Our sources also mention the appalling conditions for laborers brought in from outside China, the Caribbean, other parts of Africa, often for railway construction. Huge death rates among them, too.
And cannibalism.
Shockingly, yes. The administration apparently tolerated cannibalism among some of its auxiliary troops. It's just another layer of the horror.
It paints a picture of just absolute cruelty, a system built entirely for profit with no regard for human life. What did this do to the population overall?
Well, historians are unanimous on this.
Yeah.
There was a dramatic, catastrophic population decline during the Free State era, 1885 to 1908. It wasn't just normal fluctuation.
And not just from the direct violence, although that was significant.
Right. The biggest killer, according to the sources, was actually disease. Things like African sleeping sickness, smallpox, swine flu, dysentery. These diseases were already present, but the chaos caused by the Free State system, it supercharged them.
How so?
Think about it. Forced labor tearing communities apart, people fleeing into the forests, malnourished, stressed. Their resistance is lower, and you have the forced public soldiers constantly moving across the country, spreading these diseases everywhere.
Like vectors.
Exactly. Sleeping sickness alone is estimated to have killed maybe 500,000 people in just 1 year in 1901. And on top of the deaths, birth rates likely plummeted because of the social disruption, the fear, the separation of families.
What are the estimates for the total loss of life? I know this is debated.
It is heavily debated, and estimating populations back then is incredibly difficult. You see a huge range in the older literature, sometimes up to 10 or 13 million. A more recent academic study from 2020 suggests a range of 1 to 5 million deaths attributable to the regime's policies and their consequences is more probable based on available demographic modeling.
1 to 5 million, even at the low end. That's staggering.
It's a staggering loss of life, however you measure it.
A demographic catastrophe.
Which brings us to that really difficult question. Does what happened in the Congo Free State qualify as genocide?
Our sources show this is a very active and sensitive historical debate. There isn't full consensus.
What are the different perspectives?
Well, some historians, like Adam Hochschild, who wrote a very famous book on this, argue that while it was undeniably a slaughter on a staggering scale, it might not fit the strict UN definition of genocide, which requires proven intent to destroy an entire national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Leopold's primary motive was profit, not extermination, they'd argue.
But others disagree. Yes. Significantly, Raphael Lemkin, the lawyer who actually coined the term genocide, reportedly considered Leopold's Congo as a clear example. And many other scholars argue it does qualify, or at least could.
What's their reasoning?
They might point to the targeting of specific groups who resisted, the scale of the killing, the destruction of social structures essential for group survival. Some also argue that the definition includes intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, and the actions in the Congo certainly aimed at eliminating parts of the population who stood in the way of profit.
So it's a complex legal and historical discussion with differing interpretations of intent and definition.
Exactly. Our aim here isn't to settle it, but to present the fact that this debate exists based on the source material. The horror isn't in question, just the specific legal or historical label.
Was the world aware of this at the time? Or was it hidden?
It wasn't entirely hidden, no. Awareness grew over time, thanks to some incredibly brave individuals. George Washington Williams, an African-American journalist and historian who traveled there. He was horrified. He wrote an open letter to Leopold in 1890 detailing the abuses he witnessed.
And he used a powerful phrase.
He did. He accused Leopold's administration of crimes against humanity. It's one of the first known uses of that specific phrase in that context. Then there were campaigners like Edie Morel, a British journalist who noticed the trade imbalance shifts, leaving Congo full of rubber, returning with guns and soldiers, not goods, and realized something terrible was happening.
He started the Congo Reform Association.
Yes, alongside figures like Roger Casement, They ran a major international campaign, publishing testimonies, photographs, putting immense pressure on Leopold in Belgium.
And eventually that pressure worked.
It did. In 1908, the Belgian parliament, facing global outcry, forced Leopold to relinquish control. The Congo Free State became the Belgian Congo, a formal colony.
Did that solve everything? Did the brutality just stop overnight?
It definitely ended the worst excesses of the rubber terror system associated with Leopold's personal rule. That specific nightmare was largely over. But it wasn't a clean break.
How so?
Well, many of the same officials who ran the Free State stayed on in the Belgian colonial administration. And while the methods changed somewhat, the fundamental goal remained resource extraction. The Belgian state continued to use things like coercive taxation and forms of forced labor, especially for big infrastructure projects like railways and mines. The underlying system of external control and economic exploitation persisted.
And this pattern, this model established in the Congo, it wasn't unique, right? This was happening across Africa under various colonial powers.
Absolutely. While the Congo Free State was perhaps an extreme case in its brutality and direct personal ownership, the core principles were widespread. Colonial powers everywhere, Britain, France, Portugal, Germany, fundamentally restructured African economies to serve the needs of the metropole, the home country.
Extracting resources, disrupting local agriculture for cash crops.
Exactly. Installing administrative systems, whether direct or indirect rule, that prioritized control and extraction over local development. It created patterns of economic dependency and distorted development paths that would have consequences long, long after independence flags were raised.
Which brings us to the next phase our sources cover. Even after countries gained political independence, often in the mid-20th century, that economic freedom, it often felt like it hadn't truly arrived.
That's right. The sources talk about this as the era of neocolonialism. Political flags changed, but the underlying economic relationships often didn't, or they morphed into new forms of dependence.
How did that work? What forms did it take?
Well, one major factor highlighted is the role of international financial institutions,
Right.
the IMF, the World Bank. They're mentioned specifically in the context of countries like Burkina Faso.
In what way?
Often, developing nations needed loans for infrastructure, for budgets, but these loans came with conditions, structural adjustment programs they were often called. Which often meant things like cutting public spending, privatizing state assets, focusing on exports policies that, critics argue, kept countries locked into producing raw materials for the global north and dependent on external finance, creating cycles of debt. Sovereignty was limited by these financial strings.
And it wasn't just Western institutions. The sources mention China's role, too.
Yes, the dynamic of debt is mentioned in relation to China as well, sometimes termed debt diplomacy. While the specific mechanisms might differ, the concern raised is similar. Large loans, often for major infrastructure projects, that could lead to significant debt burdens and potentially give the lender leverage over strategic assets if the country struggled to repay. The reliance on imports, whether from Europe or China, also perpetuated this dependency, as seen in Burkina Faso's situation before recent changes.
So a complex web of financial dependencies. And overlaid on that, particularly in some regions like the Sahel, the sources mention ongoing instability.
Yes, the context of threats from terrorism and conflict with armed groups is noted as a significant challenge, particularly in the Sahel region where Burkina Faso is located. This instability creates enormous difficulties for development, and some argue can be exploited or exacerbated by external interests, although the sources don't explicitly link this instability directly to specific foreign powers like the U.S. military-industrial complex in the provided outline material. It's presented more as a difficult backdrop.
Okay, so we have this long, painful history. Brutal colonial extraction, then decades of neo-colonial economic patterns, debt, continued reliance on external powers, sometimes instability. It paints a pretty bleak picture.
It's a heavy legacy, decades, centuries, really, of systems designed for external benefit, not internal development.
And this is a big but in our story today. Here's where things start to shift dramatically. Because, as the saying goes, Africa is waking up. And this time, it's not asking for permission.
That really captures the energy coming through in the more recent sources. There's a sense of a fundamental shift, a resurgence. And Ibrahim Traoré, the current leader in Burkina Faso, is presented as almost emblematic of this new wave.
He's not painted as just another leader, though. It's more like he represents a broader movement.
Exactly. The sources frame him and leaders like him as representing a new generation, often younger, educated, unapologetically Pan-African in their outlook, and crucially, explicitly rejecting foreign manipulation and the old patterns of dependency.
And in Burkina Faso, this isn't just rhetoric, right? They're taking concrete actions.
Very concrete actions.
Yeah.
The sources detail how they've actively pushed back against external pressure. For instance, after the government change in 2022, Western nations reacted quite strongly, freezing aid, imposing sanctions.
Assuming the country would collapse without their help.
That seems to have been the assumption. But Burkina Faso didn't buckle. They refused aid that came with strings attached. They stepped away from the usual negotiations with the IMF and World Bank under those old terms.
So what do they do instead? How do you run a country without that external financing traditionally?
Well, they tackled their internal debt, nearly $5 billion in domestic debt paid off in 2024. And here's the key part. They financed this internally by mobilizing their own people. They engaged citizens, local banks, Burkinabe businesses, encouraging them to invest in government bonds backed by the country's own gold reserves.
Wow. So turning inward for capital.
Exactly. It was a direct challenge to that long-held narrative that African nations need external aid or loans on unfavorable terms to survive or develop. They demonstrated they could generate significant capital from within.
And they're using that internal capacity, that self-generated funding, to invest.
Yes, and strategically, it's not just random spending. The sources highlight specific projects that fit into a larger vision of building self-sufficiency and sovereignty.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Okay, well, take food security. They've invested $8 million in a new tomato processing plant.
Seems specific. Why tomatoes?
Because Burkina Faso, like many African countries, was importing huge amounts of processed tomato paste, often from Europe or China, even while growing tomatoes locally. This plant cuts that import dependency, creates local jobs, keeps money circulating inside Burkina Faso, and it's part of a national strategy for food sovereignty, built with state-backed investment, not foreign aid conditions.
Okay, that makes sense.
What else? Infrastructure.
Big time. The $120 million Bobo Dioulasso Ivory Coast motorway. This isn't just asphalt. It's about connecting their producers to internal markets and, crucially, to ports via a regional partner, bypassing some of the old colonial-era choke points that dictated trade routes.
Built with local labor.
Local labor and regional partners, again, reinforcing that focus on internal capacity and intra-African cooperation.
What about the modern economy? Digital finance. Key pillars. They launched Burkina, the first state-owned bank. This is huge. It's specifically designed to serve the people, often excluded by traditional banking rural communities, small businesses, the informal sector, offering basic accounts, yes, but also low-interest loans, microcredit, mobile banking, often in local languages. It's financial empowerment from the ground up.
And the digital side, you mentioned data centers.
Yeah, the Packing Digital project, $150 million investment. They're building national data centers, described in the sources as sovereign information fortresses. The goal is digital independence, moving public services online, expanding internet access, digital literacy programs, but crucially, building the infrastructure and legal frameworks so that their digital future is controlled locally, not by foreign tech giants.
So taking control of their own data, their own digital services.
Precisely. And they're also investing heavily in basics, but again, with a focus on sovereignty. Major water projects like the Ziga 2 Dam near the capital Ouagadougou, and another big urban water project focusing on piped water and sanitation.
What's the approach there?
It's about providing stable, clean, accessible public services. Using modern tech, sure, but prioritizing public access and resilience, often using local workforces. It's framed as ensuring necessities aren't dependent on external whims or private companies.
Healthcare, too.
Yes, the new regional university hospital in Bobo Dioulasso. It's not just a treatment center, it's explicitly a training institute for Burkinabe doctors and nurses, building their own medical expertise, reducing reliance on foreign medical personnel. It's linked to rural clinics, uses digital health systems, even powered by solar. Again, building internal capacity.
You see a pattern here, even with things like livestock development or housing.
It connects. The livestock project aims to modernize the sector with local processing facilities, veterinary care, cold chains supported by credit from the state bank, Burkina, empowering rural communities, boosting food security, potentially exports, but on their terms.
And the housing.
The Faso Mayo project, 50,000 affordable housing units. Again, the focus is on using locally sourced materials, employing local labor, integrating essential services like schools and clinics within these new developments. It's about building their own communities, creating jobs internally.
So when you step back, these aren't just isolated projects. Tomato plants, motorways, data centers, banks, hospitals. It sounds like a coherent national strategy.
That's exactly how the sources present it. It's a strategy rooted in a philosophy of self-reliance, investing in food sovereignty, economic connectivity, digital independence, financial inclusion, education, healthcare building blocks for a truly independent nation, funded primarily from within, leveraging their own resources, their own people.
It fundamentally flips the script on those old narratives about Africa, doesn't it? The images we often see.
It completely challenges them. Instead of helpless victims or passive recipients of aid, you see proactive, strategic planning. You see confidence, technological adoption like solar power, digital health, mobile banking, and a clear articulation of national interest.
It makes those reframes we found in the sources really hit home, like Africa is not poor, it was robbed.
Exactly. Or, for every dollar given in aid, 10 leave in minerals. This new approach seems geared towards stopping that outflow, keeping the wealth generated in Africa for the benefit of Africans.
And that other one. This isn't coming to America. This is Africa staying home and taking back what's theirs.
It's a powerful statement of intent. It's about building a future at home based on their own terms and their own resources.
So looking at all this, the historical context, the exploitation, and now this determined push for self-reliance in places like Burkina Faso. How should we understand this moment?
I think the closing thought from our outline sums it up beautifully. Africa is not rising. Africa is returning.
Returning.
Returning with memory of that history, with pride, with a clear vision for the future. And this time, the clear intention is not to be a pawn in someone else's geopolitical or economic game, but to be a powerful player in its own right.
It leaves you with a pretty powerful question, doesn't it? If this models self-funded development, rejecting external conditions, focusing on internal strength if it's truly possible, and if it spreads.
What does that mean for the old global power structures? For the institutions and dynamics that have shaped the world for centuries? And what incredible potential does it unlock across the entire continent if more nations successfully take this path?
That's definitely something to think about, a potential transformation on a massive scale.
It really is.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Africa's awakening. It's a story that's still unfolding. Stay tuned, stay curious.